Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Narcotics Anonymous Primary Purpose Group YouTube channel out of Kamloops, British Columbia, Canada. Today we're going to be reading the review draft, step 1, and this is for review and input, and it's from 1992. Step 1, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. As addicts, we each have experienced the pain, loneliness, and despair of addiction. Before coming to NA, most of us tried everything we could think of to control our use of drugs. We tried switching drugs, thinking that we only had a problem with one particular drug. We tried managing our drug use, getting high only at certain times or in certain places. We vowed to stop using altogether at a certain point. We swore we would never do things we watched other addicts do, then found ourselves doing those very things. Nothing we tried had any effect. Our active addiction progressed at every turn, overpowering our best intentions. Our experience as members of Narcotics Anonymous is that addiction is a disease, one that has disastrous effects on every area of our lives. It may progress rapidly, destroying our lives in a matter of months, or more slowly, years passing before we notice its effects. It would be impossible to precisely describe addiction in a way that everyone would agree with. However, the disease seems to affect us in the following general ways. Mentally, we become obsessed with thoughts of using. Physically, once we start using drugs, we develop a compulsion to continue using, regardless of the consequences. Spiritually, we become totally self-centered in the course of our addiction. Looking at addiction as a disease makes a lot of sense to us addicts because in our experience, addiction is progressive, incurable, and fatal. We found that when we used, we set off a craving for drugs which could never be satisfied. Our self-centered thinking fed this obsession. No power on earth could keep us from using more drugs. We could neither take enough drugs to make us feel right, nor could we stop using on our own. We found that no matter how much we used, we could not escape the overwhelming loneliness of our addiction. We were trapped in a self-destructive cycle created by our obsessive thoughts and our compulsive actions. Denial is another aspect of our disease, manifesting itself in many ways. In our addiction, we use denial to protect ourselves against the reality of what our lives had become. We often told ourselves that given the right set of circumstances, we might still be able to bring our lives under control. Always skillful at defending our actions, we refuse to accept responsibility for the damage done by our addiction. We believed that if we tried long and hard enough, substituted one drug for another, switched friends, or changed our living arrangements or occupations, our lives would improve. These rationalizations repeatedly failed us, yet we continued to cling to them. Our denial let us tell ourselves that we didn't have a problem with drugs, regardless of all evidence to the contrary. It let us tell ourselves that we could use again successfully. It allowed us to justify our actions, despite the wreckage around us resulting from our addiction. Eventually, however, we arrived at a place where we could no longer fool ourselves. No matter how hard we tried to deny our disease, we finally realized we had backed ourselves into a corner of utter despair. The overwhelming pain of our addiction brought us to our knees. We finally saw the unmanageability of our lives that resulted from our drug use. We saw the wasteful, destructive reality, our neglect of normal responsibilities, and our inability to handle our feelings. Unmanageability takes many forms, and they vary from addict to addict. Some of us neglected personal hygiene and even basic health care. Some of us noticed that we kept forgetting to eat. Some of us seemed to function very well at work or school, but couldn't cope with our feelings. Even those of us whose lives looked very manageable on the outside eventually came to the realization that our inner lives were decidedly unmanageable. Many of us recall the moment of clarity when we first came face to face with our disease. All the lies, all the pretenses, all the rationalizations we had used to justify where we stood as a result of our drug use stopped working. Who and what we were became more clear. We could no longer run from the truth. Alone, terrified of what the future held for us, we sought out the rooms of Narcotics Anonymous. Perhaps we arrived in NA without seeing the problems we had left in our wake. Because of our self-centeredness, we were often the last ones to realize that we were addicts. Many of us were persuaded by friends or family to begin attending NA meetings. Other members received even stronger encouragement from the courts. No matter how it occurred, our long-standing illusions had to be shattered. Honesty had to replace denial before we could face the truth of our addiction. We have found that we cannot recover without an ability to be honest. Learning to be honest is an ongoing process. We are able to become progressively more honest as we work the steps and continue to stay clean. In the first step, we begin to practice the spiritual principle of honesty by telling ourselves the truth about our drug use. Then we go on to tell ourselves the truth about our lives. We face what is, not the way things could be or should be. It doesn't matter where we come from or how good or bad we think we've had it. When we finally turn to Narcotics Anonymous in the 12 steps, we begin to find relief. The honest sharing of members of Narcotics Anonymous makes us realize that we have been living a lie. As we begin working the first step, it is important to ask ourselves some basic personal questions. Can I control my use of drugs? Am I willing to stop using? Am I willing to go to any lengths to find recovery? Given a choice between finding a new way of life in NA and the jails, institutions, or death we may face if we continue in our addiction, recovery begins to make sense. We cannot begin to recover unless we stop using drugs. Total abstinence from all drugs is the only way we can begin to treat our addiction. However, abstinence is only the beginning. Recovery really begins when we start to apply the spiritual principles contained in the 12 steps of NA in all areas of our lives. Our only hope for a life free from active addiction is a profound emotional and spiritual change. Our experience shows that it is necessary for us to be willing to go to any lengths to receive this precious gift of recovery. In recovery, we'll be introduced to spiritual principles such as the honesty and surrender required for the first step. If we faithfully practice these principles, they will transform our perceptions and the way we live our lives. As we work the first step, we find that surrender is not what we thought it was. In the past, we probably thought of surrender as something that only weak and cowardly people did. We saw only two choices: either keep fighting to control our using, or just cave in completely and let our lives fall to pieces. We felt we were in a battle to control our using and that if we surrendered, the drugs would win. In recovery, we find surrender to be something else entirely. The process of surrender is extremely personal for each one of us. Only we as individuals know when we've done it. We cannot stress the importance of surrender enough, for it is the very process that enables us to recover. When we surrender, we know in our hearts that we've had enough. We're tired of fighting. A relief comes over us as we finally realize that the struggle is over. No matter how hard we fought, we finally reach the point where we realize that we couldn't stop using on our own. The point of surrender for all addicts who have gone on to find recovery. We were able to admit our powerlessness over our addiction. We gave up completely. Even though we didn't know exactly what would happen, we gathered up our courage and admitted our powerlessness. We gave up the illusion that we could control our using, thereby opening the door to recovery. Many of us begin the process of surrender when we identify ourselves at an NA meeting with our name and the words, "I'm an addict." Once we admit that we are addicts and that we cannot stop using drugs on our own, we are able to stay clean on a daily basis with the help of other recovering addicts in Narcotics Anonymous. The paradox of this admission is evident once we work the first step. As long as we think we can control our using, we are almost forced to continue. The minute we admit we're powerless, we never have to use again. This reprieve from having to use is the most profound gift we can receive, for it saves our lives. Once we have admitted our powerlessness, it becomes necessary for us to seek help from other recovering addicts. Through our collective experience, we have found that we can accomplish together what we cannot do alone. As we attend meetings regularly, we can find great comfort in the experience of those traveling this path with us. Perhaps for the first time, we find others just like us in the rooms of NA. Coming to NA has been described by many members as coming home. We find ourselves welcomed and accepted by other recovering addicts. We finally find a place where we belong. Though we are sure to be helped by the sharing we hear at meetings, we need to find one special person to help us in our recovery, a sponsor. Our sponsor will help us through the 12 steps and share with us his or her own experience. Listening to our sponsor's experience and applying it to our own lives is how we take advantage of one of the most beautiful and practical aspects of recovery: the therapeutic value of one addict helping another. Through our developing relationship with our sponsor, we learn about the principle of trust. By following the suggestions of our sponsor instead of only our own ideas, we learn the principles of open-mindedness and willingness. Our sponsor will help us take the necessary steps along the path of recovery. Talking honestly with our sponsor about our drug use and how it affected our lives will help us work the first step thoroughly. We must always remember where we came from and where our addiction took us. We have only a daily reprieve from our active addiction. Each day we must accept the fact that we cannot use drugs successfully. Even long periods of abstinence do not guarantee us continued freedom from the pain and trouble that addiction can bring. The symptoms of our disease can always return. We may find that we are powerless in ways we never imagined. No matter how our disease displays itself, we must take its deadly nature into account. As we do, we develop a fuller awareness of the nature of our disease. This is a natural process of the recovery process. This is a natural part of the recovery process. Few recovering addicts will say that the recovery process is easy, because it's not. Many have attempted it and given up. It takes great courage and perseverance to continue in recovery day after day and year after year. Part of the recovery process is to move forward in spite of whatever may stand in our way. Because long-lasting change and recovery happens slowly, we will turn to the first step again and again. The disease of addiction can manifest itself in a variety of mental obsessions and compulsive actions that have nothing to do with drugs. We may find ourselves obsessed with behaving compulsively over things we never had problems with until we stopped using drugs. We may once again try to fill the awful emptiness we sometimes feel with something outside ourselves. Anytime we find ourselves using something to fix how we feel, it's time to work the first step again. We are never completely immune from having our lives become unmanageable, even after years of recovery. If problems pile up and our resources for coping with them dwindle, we may feel out of control and in too much pain to do anything constructive for ourselves. We feel overwhelmed by life, and that feeling seems to make everything worse. When our lives seem to be falling apart, we reapply ourselves to the basics of the Narcotics Anonymous program. We stay in close contact with our sponsor, work the steps, and go to meetings. We surrender again, knowing that victory lies in the admission of defeat. The feeling of loving and acceptance we find in the fellowship at Narcotics Anonymous allows us to begin to recover from our addiction. We start to learn a new way to live. The emptiness from which we suffered begins to be filled through working and living the 12 steps. We start to find a solution to our hopelessness. We begin to learn that our addiction is being addressed in all its complexity by this simple program. There is a deeply spiritual nature to our program of recovery. The 12 steps of Narcotics Anonymous will take us on a journey that will far exceed our expectations. Working and living the steps will lead us to a spiritual awakening. Step 1 is the beginning of this spiritual journey. To embark on this personal quest, we must become willing to humble ourselves to this program and its principles, for our future hinges on our willingness to grow spiritually. We are starting a new way of life, one that offers great joy and happiness. It goes without saying that once we stop using drugs, many of our problems disappear along with the drugs. However, recovery doesn't exempt us from pain. Living life on life's terms combines moments of happiness with moments of sadness. Wonderful events are interspersed with painful ones. We will experience a full range of feelings about the events in our lives. When events beyond our control are causing pain or unmanageability in our lives, working the first step is the beginning of our solution. After the struggle, we surrender. We become teachable. We admit the problem so we can go on to find the solution. The solution to our addiction lies in working the rest of the steps, beginning with step 2.